Russia's campaign to conquer Ukraine's eastern Donbas region is as fierce as ever, and Ukraine is sounding the alarm. Russian forces are launching attacks on dozens of towns in Luhansk and Donetsk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is demanding more heavy weaponry from the West, describing the situation in Donbas as extremely difficult.
Moments of joy in times of war. This is the first civilian wedding in Irpin, a city close to Kyiv that was devastated by conflict.
Well, it's a joyful feeling, but also very unusual because there's a war going on. It's unusual to get married during a war.
No need to give up. Life goes on no matter what. The truth is on our side. Ukraine will be the winner of this war. The only question is when it will end. That's what's worrying everyone the most. Meanwhile, Ukraine says the fighting in the east is fiercer than ever before.
The situation remains difficult and is getting worse. The enemy is using all its power and means to capture our territory and surround our troops. The fighting has reached its maximum intensity to date.
90% of the Luhansk region is under Russian occupation, its governor says.
The situation is very tense because the Russians have sent all their forces to storm the Luhansk region, to capture towns and to bring the roads under their control. They are attacking from different directions. It's very hard, but we've been holding the defensive line for 4 months now. Despite the fact that the enemy has suffered significant losses, they keep pushing towards our defensive line, step by step, with artillery shelling.
Luhansk and Donetsk together make up the Donbas, where Russian-backed separatists control large parts of the territory. Russian forces have shelled some 40 towns across Donbas as they battle to seize the entire region. So even as life in Irpin and Kyiv slowly returns to normal, elsewhere, normality is a very long way off.
Well, earlier I spoke with our correspondent in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, Rebecca Ritters, and I asked her what has she been hearing about the situation in eastern Ukraine.
Well, I don't have anything better to tell you on that front. Things are not looking good by all accounts, with Ukraine authorities even admitting that they are really struggling to maintain any kind of upper hand, that they've actually lost the upper hand in the Donbas region. The governor of Luhansk has said that Russians now control almost 95% of that region. That's up from 90% from last week. So they are making progress. They are moving forward, and the Ukrainians are really struggling to even hold them and keep them back at this stage. You know, we're hearing reports for every one rocket or one artillery that's fired from the Russian side, from the Ukrainian side, you've got 10 coming in the other direction. So, you know, it sort of gives you an indication of sort of the heaviness on the Russian side there. So it is looking really, really bad, you could say, and you know, certainly with Ukraine admitting that they're losing that upper hand, or that they've, you know, by all intents and purposes lost it, that really is saying something. And this is going to be a very decisive moment in the battle. You've got President Zelensky and the Foreign Minister just singing out, screaming, shouting for more weapons. They are really calling on the international community. This is almost too late. We've also seen renewed shelling in Kharkiv, Brent. So things are really heating up in the east of the country.
And I'm wondering, what are people there in Kyiv saying? You know, we heard, for example, yesterday from the former U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, saying that for the war to end, Ukraine should give up a little bit of its territory. I mean, I know a lot of people in Ukraine are upset by that, but is there some thinking beginning to take root that maybe losing a little bit of territory will have to be the price for ending this war?
Not from anyone I've spoken to. Really, the consensus is here that if we give an inch, they'll take a mile. That's what people are telling me. They really do not think that Ukraine should give up any territory. They said they did that already in 2015-16, that they gave up, Crimea. They thought that would suffice, but, it's clear that it hasn't. They say that, if we do go ahead, as Henry Kissinger said, and give up the Donbass region, that, in a couple of years, couple of months, who knows, a decade, they'll be back for more. So really the feeling here that that is not an option, as President Zelensky's been saying as well. He's just not going to give up territory, and that seems to be the popular opinion here.
GW's Rebecca Ritters with a sobering assessment of the situation in eastern Ukraine tonight. Rebecca, thank you. And here is a quick roundup of some of the other developments in this war. 2 captured Russian soldiers have pleaded guilty at the second war crimes trial to be held in Ukraine. They're accused of shelling civilian infrastructure in a town near Kharkiv. Prosecutors have called for 12-year prison sentences. A verdict is expected on Tuesday. Russia's Supreme Court has delayed until June a decision on whether captured fighters from Ukraine's Azov regiment should be designated as terrorists. The Russian government considers the unit a neo-Nazi organization. Now, if the regiment is designated a terrorist group, Russia will be unlikely to include its fighters in any prisoner exchange with Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the Biden administration wants to lead countries opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine into a broader coalition to counter China's global influence. He says that China is the only country with the intent, as well as increasingly the power, to reshape the global order. Russian President Vladimir Putin says that Moscow is ready to help avert a looming food crisis if Western countries lift sanctions imposed against his country over the war in Ukraine. Russia's blockade of Ukraine's ports has halted the export of millions of tons of grain, but the Kremlin insists that it is not to blame for global food supply problems. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and why today he may have felt like the lonely leader in the West. Scholz delivered the closing address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, a meeting where the globe's economic and political leaders traditionally rub elbows, meet and greet, but not this year. Scholz was the only leader of all the G7 countries who traveled to Davos this year. And the jury is still out on what being the only one there means or symbolizes. The world's leaders, especially in Europe and the U.S., they're busy dealing with the war in Ukraine, broken global supply chains, and soaring inflation. That's fair enough, but that did not keep Ukrainian President Zelensky from Zooming with the movers and shakers in Davos. Still, among Western leaders, Scholz was the only one who bothered to show up. We have this report tonight.
Discussion of the war in Ukraine and its effects dominated this year's World Economic Forum. Participants examined solutions for the leading global threats: food insecurity, energy, and the range of economic crises. These topics were also central to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's keynote address, which wrapped up Thursday's event. The pandemic and Russia's war against Ukraine are threatening to roll back progress made over the last decades. Most dramatic, the fight against hunger and poverty. We are risking the world's biggest famine in decades if we don't respond decisively. During the G7 presidency, we launched Alliance for Global Food Security with the World Bank. Germany has set aside nearly €500 million. The global food crisis is a major risk for poorer countries in Asia and Africa.
It's a very, very difficult time for African countries because it's like it's gotten them offside. Countries are in more debt because of COVID. Countries are struggling with climate change. And 125 million people got hungry because of COVID globally. A lot of those, 30% of those are in Africa. Another additional 100 million people is expected to go hungry. So this could be really serious.
And now, as the world's most powerful players leave Davos, the focus will turn to putting the plans and promises they've discussed into motion.
Well, for more now, we want to bring in Anastasia Fedik. She is Assistant Professor of Finance at the Haas School of Business in Berkeley, California, and she is Ukrainian. Professor, it's good to have you on the program tonight. I want to talk about the global economic aspect of this in just a moment. But first, I want to ask you about what we saw in Davos this week. Ukrainian President Zelensky criticized world leaders there for sitting on their hands while Russia tries to cut off parts of Ukraine. Yesterday, the former U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, suggested that Ukraine should basically compromise with Russia, find peace by giving up part of its territory. Do you get the sense there that the world, the international community, is trying to pressure Ukraine to hurry up and get this war out of our way?
So we see those kinds of perspectives from people like Kissinger, from people like Noam Chomsky on the other end of the spectrum. I'm still optimistic that those are fringe beliefs on both kind of the further right and the further left, because when we think seriously about statements like that, of course, there's the obvious moral issue, but even leaving those aside, so thinking about the pragmatic side, there are two problems with this belief that somehow ceding some territory to Russia is a legitimate end to the war. The first is that it's incorrect, that appeasement leads to lasting peace. That's not what we see historically. And the second is that advocating this perspective also undermines Ukraine's position at the negotiating table. Just even voicing it gives more negotiating power to Russia, so that whatever kind of diplomatic solution we might be able to reach will not be one that leads to lasting peace. Of course, from Ukraine's perspective, we saw a survey coming out this past week on the views of Ukrainians in Ukraine regarding the potential to cede some territory in exchange for peace, and the overwhelming majority, so 82% of Ukrainians are against that, including 78% of Ukrainians who are actually in territories that are currently occupied by Russia. And of course, the reason that Ukrainians are so consistent on this is that they're aware of what the de facto territorial concessions in 2014 did. They did not prevent the war this year.
And let's talk about the sanctions that are in place right now. I'm wondering, are they enough to win the war for Ukraine? And are they strict enough? I mean, we still have Europe, I'm thinking of Hungary, through the back door, transferring huge sums of money to Moscow for oil and gas. And we just saw the Russian ruble hit a 2-year high against the dollar and the euro last Friday. I mean, this doesn't sound or look like an economy that's about to collapse.
For sure. And I think we should make a differential between sanctions that have been imposed properly, so some of the export sanctions to Russia of key components, I think those are working. The issue is in sanctions that are not wholeheartedly imposed, so including energy sanctions in the EU. We're actually having a counterproductive effect from having these lengthy discussions and talks without any action. So in financial economics, we have this concept of rational expectations. That if the market expects something to happen tomorrow, it's going to price that in today. That's what we're seeing with this protracted talk of an embargo without actually doing an embargo. We actually see a rise in energy prices. So effectively, citizens in Europe are paying more for their oil and gas without having any adverse effect on Russia. It's kind of the worst of both worlds.
Do you think, Professor, let's just take the case of Germany. Germany, incredibly dependent on Russian oil and gas. If Germany were to go cold turkey this year, would it see the price that it pays for energy be higher than the inflation that you're talking about that's already being pumped into the market price?
Yes. So of course, the market is already pricing that in. It's not pricing it in fully because there's some uncertainty, right? So the market is partially pricing it in. So it's going to be less dire than what we think when we assume that the market hasn't priced it in. But the other thing that I think is really important for countries like Germany to understand is that this kind of tight trade relationship with Russia, it imposes constraints on both ends. So of course, demand for Russian oil and gas is somewhat inelastic. It's difficult to get out, but so is the supply. Russia cannot just easily divert all of its energy exports elsewhere. So temporary measures like price caps, I think instituting those while we work out the details of a full embargo would be very helpful.
I want to ask you before we run out of time, is it too early to be talking about reconstruction of Ukraine. I mean, is it realistic right now to be talking about a Marshall Plan, Marshall-style plan for Ukraine, or is this just rhetoric on a grand scale that we're hearing right now?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely realistic and necessary to be thinking about it for two reasons. First, because that actually interplays with what we just talked about now, the price of, say, Russian energy. That needs to be factored in. In some sense, Europe is already paying a huge tariff on the energy imports from Russia because every dollar that Russia uses for weapons is basically $10 of infrastructure destruction in Ukraine. So it's important to kind of be aware of that scale and then price it in when we're making other decisions. Also on a brighter side, hopefully, Ukraine is able to withstand this war. And with a well-designed Marshall Plan, I think it's going to be a fantastic investment opportunity for the world economy.
Anastasia Fedek, Assistant Professor of Finance at the Haas School of Business in Berkeley, California. Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.